Hello, good afternoon to everybody who's tuned in for this week's Care Vision's Healthy Aging conversation. I'm Jeremy Hughes. I'm here to host this afternoon. We'll be starting in just a few minutes when my guest will be Lenny Shallcross. I'll introduce him when we get to 4 o'clock on the dot, so there's just time for you to grab your cup of tea and settle in for this afternoon's conversation. Many thanks to so many people who joined the conversation we had with Terry Waite last week, both live and the thousands and thousands of people who listened to the recorded conversation. And of course, you can do that again today. If you aren't listening live, welcome, and you'll be hearing this recorded. If you are joining us live, please encourage others to as well. And of course, there's the opportunity to ask questions. Whilst we're heading towards 4 o'clock, I just wanted to share with you something that landed on my desk today, which is the latest issue of the Journal of Dementia Care, which is the key UK journal that really helps everyone involved in healthy aging and particularly looking after people with dementia. Because of lockdown and COVID-19, the journal this month is virtual and online only, but I would recommend that you go there and have a look at it. And what's interesting is a couple of things stood out for me. One is how much virtual support there is, how people have adapted to use online ways of communicating and engaging during coronavirus. Of course, Care Visions themselves, who sponsor this weekly conversation, are doing that with their videos, which bring dementia therapy directly to people in their own home. But it was interesting how many people are finding ways of connecting despite coronavirus. I suppose a highlight for me was the mass Singing for the Brain put on by Alzheimer Society, hosted by Vicky McClure a few weeks ago, where something like over 20,000 people, I think, tuned in at one time or another to watch that program and get inspired by the way in which music can make such a big difference to people affected by dementia. But the other aspect of the journal, which I thought was also important, is showing how community-based activity is incredibly important, even in areas that tend to get ignored. And there's a lovely article featuring work in rural Norfolk, looking at how you can reach people who aren't in big cities, who aren't in towns, but still need support. So I would urge everyone who has a moment to spare to please go online and look for the Journal of Dementia Care July-August issue. I was also pleased to contribute an article myself looking at some of the opportunities in the 2020s to do what we did in the 2010s, which is get dementia on the map and drive the agenda forward. And although coronavirus has changed many things, I also think there are a whole load of opportunities that are now before us. So please do have a look at the Journal of Dementia Care, latest issue out now. The other thing in the journal that's encouraging, and I think everyone will look forward to, is the Dementia Congress, which happens in November this year. And the journal this week has announced that it will still be going ahead in Bournemouth on the 11th and 12th of November. There'll also be some online participation, but for so many people with dementia and their family caregivers and professional staff working in care homes, in the NHS and in the charities, coming together at the Dementia Congress is a real opportunity to learn from each other and be inspired by each other's experience and practice. Not least, it's an opportunity for so many people who themselves have lived experience of dementia to get their voice heard. And that's difficult to do online. So please do come to the Dementia Congress if you can in November, and join online if you can't get to Bournemouth on the 11th and 12th of November this year. So that's my, as it were, parish notices for today. That gives you up to date with some of the things that are going on in the world of dementia. We're just coming up to 4 o'clock, and so I'll be introducing my guest for today, Lenny Shallcross, in just a minute or so. If you haven't already done so, please do look at some of the material that Care Visions have available. There's not just these live conversations and the videos that I've talked about, which are their dementia therapy videos that I'll be asking Lenny Shallcross's views about shortly. But there's also some perspectives where individuals are reflecting on their own experience of older age and the opportunities to support people well. There's some lovely moving little videos that you can watch, and they're all available on YouTube and on Facebook for people to look at. So please do take every opportunity to make available to you in your own home and with your family that wealth of material. So I'm now going to ask Lenny Shallcross to join us. He's come on screen now. Hello, Lenny. Good to see you this afternoon. Lenny Shallcross is the Executive Director of the World Dementia Council. Before that, he was heading up the Dementia Friends and Dementia Friendly Communities programs at Alzheimer Society, and he's done a spell working in government as well. He's well used to bringing about change, a real campaigner for change, I would describe Lenny as. But he's also an avid reader, And so, Lenny, I thought we could just start by you telling us a little bit about what you're reading at the moment.
Well, I've just finished a book called A Whole Life by Robert Seethaler. That was, I think it's about 5 years old, and nothing really happens in the entire book. Someone is born in 1900 in an Alpine village. Great events happen for their entire life, which they are tangentially a part of, and then they die.
Right.
And it's a beautiful book. It's relatively short, very light to hold in bed, which is very useful. But it's there is a lesson in it, in that we tend to, you just mentioned in your introductory remarks about Corona changes everything. Well, actually, for most people, most of the time, despite the great events of history, life just kind of carries on, much as it always has done, much as it always will do. So perhaps sometimes the lesson of this book, really, short, easy read, is that the bright light is sometimes a bit more distracting than the day-to-day mundaneness, which is the lived experience of many people.
Right. No, that's a good reflection, that everyday life goes on and everyday life needs to be supported. And thinking of bright lights, I feel I'm getting darker and darker here as the clouds gather outside. So I hope people can still see me as the light continues to fade around me. So Lenny, let's talk a little bit about the World Dementia Council. You're the executive director. Tell us a little bit about what led to the World Dementia Council being set up.
Well, it was set up in 2013 by the UK government on behalf of the G8, as it then was, while Russia was a member. And it followed a summit that David Cameron hosted here in London, where I am speaking from, as part of the UK's presidency of the G8. At that summit, the international community made a series of commitments by 2025 that were around research, awareness, care, and risk reduction, and how international collaboration and cooperation would help accelerate progress towards those goals. I think if you look at what has happened in the last few weeks with COVID, you see the importance of and the results of collaboration and cooperation internationally. And if you look back over the last decade on something like HIV, again, you see that it was only through international collaboration at a scientific level, at an advocacy level, and at a government level that the international community were able to address a challenge. And the thinking behind the G8 summit focused on dementia, the 2025 goals and the establishment of the World Dementia Council was that what has led to success in HIV, what we have demonstrated in COVID over the last few weeks, needs to happen in the dementia space so that we can deliver real change for people wherever they are in the world over the next few years.
So that's quite an ambitious program. And you mentioned HIV/AIDS. I think I'm right in saying the only other time in history the G8 or now the G7 have focused on a health issue was when Tony Blair, when the UK had presidency of the G7 or G8 during his premiership, hosted a summit on HIV/AIDS in the same way that David Cameron did on dementia. Are there lessons we can learn for what happened about HIV/AIDS as a result of that summit?
Yeah, I mean, if you look, the UK is on the verge of doing something transformational or highly unexpected. By 2030, HIV transmission in the UK will largely have disappeared. Now, that is partly a consequence of awareness, stigma, attitudinal change. And it's partly a consequence of the development of treatments that stop transmission happening in the first place, and treatments that make people uninfectious. And ultimately, today, astonishingly, if you are HIV positive and you are under 65, you actually have a better life expectancy than someone who isn't 65. So the story on one level from what has happened internationally over the last decade is this global triumph, that in so many countries, a disease that killed people, in their 20s and their 30s and the prime of their lives is now cured. Now, there's a flip side to that. So on the one hand, we've got this global triumph, and on the other, there is a global tragedy, which is that the global death rates have more than halved since they peaked in 2004, but still today, 750,000 people will die of HIV, and they will die in lower middle income countries. And that's because the bit that we got right on HIV was the global cooperation that led to treatments that went through high income countries that protected lots of citizens. The bit that we got wrong was global justice, which is that lots of people who would benefit from treatments didn't get them for years, and in many cases aren't getting them. And
so let's just go back before we go into the treatment and drawing the parallels with dementia on treatment. The other thing you mentioned at the beginning there was about stigma and awareness, and about how on HIV/AIDS that's changed over the last 20 years. Do you see similar changes happening on dementia, and how important is that to get a change in stigma and awareness if we're going to tackle what is a global challenge in dementia and healthy aging as an issue?
So there are two different strands to that I would pull out. One of which is that is a bit wider than HIV stigma in particular. I'm a gay man, and over the last 20 years, there has been the most astonishing societal transformation of attitudes towards being gay. Now, I don't think that would have happened had people carried on dying of HIV. So that actually the development of treatments tackled a wider societal prejudice because it removed fear. So that we tend to kind of talk about treatments and stigma as if they existed in separate buckets that are never joined. But there's actually more interconnectivity between them. I think the story of HIV and the wider story of the gay rights movement says a lot about how they are related. Now, there are parallels between the stigma that is associated with HIV and the stigma that is associated with dementia. Now, it's difficult to generalize because it's they're very different types of stigma, but one of the biggest challenges that people with dementia have is their participation in society. Mm-hmm. And actually, in countries where that there is a high awareness and participation of HIV positive people in society, more of them appear to be accessing antiviral treatments and therefore living with dementia. Because when disease is hidden away in the corners of society is when you get worse outcomes. So
do you see the same happening on dementia? Because I mentioned the Dementia Friends program that you led the work on in the UK, which I think is now extended to 50 countries around the world. Is that base level of public awareness a really important precursor for creating the public interest that creates the willingness to engage in finding treatments and a better future for everyone affected?
Yeah, so I think people use very different terminology in different countries. So some people talk about awareness, some people, it's more common in the US to talk about concern, but they broadly mean the same thing, which is people believe there's a problem and believe people with power, whether that's health systems or governments or funders, need to address that problem. And I think without that awareness or concern, you will not get solutions. So if there is one thing in any country that is going to help advance us collectively as a movement towards the goal of people living well with dementia and there being treatments available for the first time, then you need to raise awareness. That is where it all begins.
So if that noise is being created a bit more, what's gone wrong? Because you talked about the World Dementia Council being set up in 2013 with some 2025 goals. One of those goals was a drug treatment or a medical intervention. We're over halfway to your 2025 deadline, and we've got nothing. What's gone wrong?
So at the end of the pipeline, it's a mixed picture. So aducanumab, which is a drug that's been developed by Biogen, is currently waiting for FDA approval.
FDA is the American Drug Agency.
Drug regulator. If it is approved, that will be the first disease-modifying treatment that we have had. Now, at the same time, there's recently there being a readout of the Diane trial that showed a mixed picture. To some extent, there were encouraging signs. They've kind of gone for an open label trial to test whether or not that some of the drugs that were used in that trial were effective. But you're right, at this point, at the end of the pipeline, we don't have anything. However, what we do have is the things that will result in treatments being developed. Now, there is a perception, I think, around the development of science in general and treatments that we sort of wait for this sort of eureka moment. We've all kind of got in our minds, like Newton and his apple and all the rest of it, you know, the genius who comes out and says, I've solved the problem. Now, for those of you who kind of obsessively followed some of those early government news conferences around coronavirus, you'll have heard the chief scientist repeatedly say, this is not how science works. Science works by the slow accumulation of knowledge, by testing hypotheses, by developing new things, and step by step you make progress. And actually, at the end of the dementia pipeline, we might have drugs available. We don't know yet. There's a regulatory process. But what we do have is a lot more knowledge and understanding of the biological processes that result in disease. We have got far better biomarkers, we've got far better tech, and we are exploiting big data. Now, add all those things together, and the pathway over the next few years is one of hope. And look back over the last 30 years, and it wasn't that long ago that a dementia diagnosis was probable Alzheimer's, because we couldn't even say you had Alzheimer's. So yes, we are not there yet. We are more than halfway through, and actually we're on the right course.
Okay, so that's a hopeful message, but it doesn't do much for people living with dementia today. They can feel that there may be something coming for future generations, or maybe for them in 5-10 years' time. The other thing you mentioned in terms of one of the priorities for the World Dementia Council was prevention. And as I recall, back in 2013, when the council was set up by David Cameron, prevention wasn't really on the agenda. Nobody thought you could do anything to prevent dementia. Has that changed over the last 5-6 years?
So when we talk about prevention, people tend to think of just the first bit of prevention, which is not getting the disease in the first place. Now, there is a whole trajectory of prevention, which is slowing down the development of the disease, and then the stage of slowing down or mitigating the medical impact of it. So in your classic WHO prevention model, there are 3 stages to prevention. Now, on the first of those stages, stopping people develop the disease in the first place, which, I mean, everyone would agree is the best outcome, there is a sort of growing international evidence base around the benefits of lifestyle interventions. So you saw a few years ago here in the UK, the Lancet Commission published a review of evidence, and they suggested around kind of a third of cases of dementia could be avoided through, at a population level, different lifestyle approaches. And at the same time, in a lot of countries now, we are seeing fewer cases of dementia than you would expect, which sort of underlines the presumptions that sit behind the Lancet Commission. And WHO recently published, last year, some risk reduction guidelines that again said the evidence at population level was there for interventions, even if it wasn't there for an individual. Now, I think part of the challenge of this is lots of these interventions are generally good for us anyway. You know, it's a case of childhood education, it's dealing with midlife hypertension, it's obesity, it's exercise, it's healthy diets, it's getting your eyes tested, probably. You know, there are lots and lots of these things. And paradoxically, the story of the last decade has evidence that good cardiovascular health is good for you, good cardiovascular health is probably good for your brain, is that as a nation, we've got fatter and fatter. So there is a big challenge, and highlighted by Corona and, you know, remarks by the UK Prime Minister yesterday, to make the prevention, this bit of the prevention agenda, real for people.
So in trying to do that, go back to something you said a minute ago, because it'd be good, probably a lot of people listening to this will get a bit confused, as I've got. You drew a distinction with the World Health Organization between population level change and change for people. Can you just explain the difference? Because it sounds like the danger is you can get things that work in the academic journals but don't make a difference to everyday life.
So it's sort of in the event of you having a well-educated population that was healthy, ate well, etc., 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 you would expect fewer cases of dementia. Now, for you as an individual, we are not in a position to say, if you stop smoking at 40, you have a lower chance of developing dementia, because we just don't know enough about why some individuals go on to develop dementia and why others don't. So, and I think that's one of the ambiguities around the kind of the challenges of public health messaging in the dementia space, because we don't have lots and lots of evidence to explain what these absurd phenomena are.
Yeah. So come back to me as an individual and many of the people who are listening and watching today. What are there things we can do that will make a difference? What can I do if I'm watching this and I'm caring for somebody with dementia, or I've got dementia myself, mild dementia, I'm conscious of the need to do something to make my life better. What can individuals do whilst all this research is going on in the background?
So there we're talking about people in slightly later stages of a disease trajectory. And one of the challenges in the dementia space is that when we talk about prevention, we're talking about people who've got no biological disease. So even if our science was at its most, we just couldn't find the disease. Then you've got people who've got the biological disease, but they wouldn't have a clinical diagnosis. The level of decline hasn't reached the point where you would see symptoms of dementia. And then we've got the third stage, which you're talking about, which is people who have a clinical diagnosis or could have a clinical diagnosis. So the dementia has reached the point where it's impacting on their life in some way and is noticeable. And how do you manage that? Now, and this is where, you know, there's been, as you will know, as many people will know, there's been a long debate in the UK about this language around an early diagnosis and a timely diagnosis, and so on and so forth, and what the cost economic benefits of it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there is pretty good evidence that non-pharmacological interventions provides help and support to individuals when those interventions are well tailored for their needs. Now, that is not to say necessarily that it slows the development of the disease. So it's not the equivalent of some kind of chemo drug that means that you live for 20 years with cancer, kind of thing. But it does provide benefits to individuals to help them live better with dementia. Now, there is no, in answer to your question, that is what should an individual do. I would say that an individual needs to seek out the support of an organisation or their health professional to get advice on the whole different range of non-pharmacological interventions that are open to people, and to ensure that they're achieving dementia, accessing the support to which they are entitled. Because the difference that you see in outcomes is people who have support around them live longer in the community, and people who don't have support end up in a crisis situation. They end up in A&E, and they end up in care much sooner than they need to.
And one of the challenges, of course, with coronavirus is a lot of that community-based support has been more difficult or been impossible to provide because people have been locked away at home, worried about their future. I mentioned before we started, for anyone who came on earlier, the Singing for the Brain mass event that happened with Vicky McClure online on Facebook. Do you think there's more that can be made available online to enable people to get access to those non-pharmacological support, even when they haven't got the community-based places that they used to go and visit and join, the groups they used to be part of?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about something like coronavirus, interesting is perhaps the wrong word for something that's had such an impact on us, is that it forces innovation. It forces people to think about how they are delivering a service proposition and to try things that they haven't tried before. So what you see throughout is that clinical trials are being delivered in a different way as a consequence of coronavirus. Diagnosis is happening in a different way as a consequence of coronavirus. And as you mentioned, service proposition is being delivered in a different way because people are forced to innovate. Now, some of this won't be effective. As you were saying in your introductory remarks about Dementia Congress, everyone's fine with these kind of online conferences, but actually people do want to meet in person. So the innovation that you've seen in the way that support is being delivered might be great long term, or it might not quite work for people long term because they prefer a new offer. We just don't know yet. But what I would say is that what has been very impressive from a whole range of service providers in the for-profit sector and the not-for-profit sector and in health providers is that in response to this fact that we're all having to stay at home, that they have innovated to try and look after people with dementia.
Okay, and one of the things that people will know about, because Care Visions are sponsoring this series of conversations, is the Care Visions videos that they put online, when previously they were providing community-based support in London and in China. Do you think that kind of support is helpful, to go online and join in some of these programs when you can't get access any other way?
So you will know this anecdote because of your time at Alzheimer's Society, but during looking at the service proposition at Alzheimer's Society, looking at the service model that was being delivered, and somebody had said, well, you provide a great service, but I find it annoying that the dementia support worker has to come into my house. Because in doing so, I have to tidy my house. And actually, I Skype the kids in Australia, so I've got no problem having a service delivered online. And actually, it would be a lot easier for me because then I'd only need to tidy the backdrop. So I think that one of the things that we're seeing is people are developing service propositions that people living with dementia are actually finding useful. Now, we won't know for sure which of these innovations prove to have a long-lasting impact and which have less desirable or limited benefits. But the general, I think the lesson I would take from that anecdote of the time of working at Alzheimer's Society is that actually lots of people with dementia are very comfortable with things being delivered online because so much of our life is now done online. So
Yeah,
I think there's a positive there.
no, it's a good message, although I would hasten to add that there will be some people who don't engage online, and I am very concerned about a sort of digital underclass, if you like, of people who don't use Facebook, who don't use computers, and become even more marginalised and isolated. So I think we have to remember those people as well. There's a number of questions coming in, which I'll have a look at in a minute and ask you from the questions from some of the people who are viewing. But let me just come back to where we began. So you've got these 2025 goals that were set by the World Dementia Council, by the G8 summit in 2013. Has coronavirus made it's now impossible to meet those goals? Do you feel hopeful that we'll still get there by 2025, or does it all mean that we now need to think again because of coronavirus?
So, I mean, the first thing to say about coronavirus is it's obviously had a significant impact on people with dementia. So lots of people who have died have had dementia. And that's an important kind of point to acknowledge when talking about the development, the 2025 goals, because actually for most people, to go back to your earlier point that you made, most people about drugs, most people right now would be, my family member is at risk of dying because they have dementia and of coronavirus, so let's not worry about 2025 goals. So the impact, the immediate impact has been on the care sector and on lots of vulnerable people living in society. Some of the longer term impacts, and we're beginning to look at this now, are harder to quantify. We know clinical trials have been disrupted. We know funding streams have been disrupted. We suspect that diagnosis pathways have been disrupted. We suspect that positive learnings, you mentioned around the digitalization that you see from the research space through to service provision. But it's a mixed picture. However, I remain confident that broadly we are on track to deliver the 2025 goals. It's going to be challenging, but the direction is right.
So one of the questions is from somebody called Imogen, who precisely asks that. She says, are you optimistic of the future of dementia care and treatment in the UK at least? And you're saying you probably are, or you're not sure?
I am a sort of cynical optimist, I would say, by default. So I think that there are lots of things where we can find reasons to be optimistic. We know far more about science. We have far better data around people's lived experience in the care space. We have much higher levels of awareness. I mean, the UK is one of the highest levels of awareness of dementia in the world. You have strong and passionate dementia community in the UK. At the same time, all of this stuff is a bit fragile. The victories that have been made have to continually be fought for, because otherwise you get retrenchment and you get other issues taking up the space.
So there's another question that picks up on that from somebody called Tim, who's asking, and I think the British experience on coronavirus is telling here, are there other countries in the world who are doing better on dementia than us? In the same way that other countries seem to have handled coronavirus better than us?
So you're here talking about the kind of research, care, awareness, risk reduction. So there are whole different bits of it. I would say that if you look at, say, the US, you see much higher levels of funding. The US government is the single biggest funder of dementia research in the world. They're spending $2.4 billion, which dwarfs what anyone else is doing. But equally, you can look at other places, like Japan has huge levels of around community engagement, building a dementia-friendly society. You see a very similar thing in Singapore. You're seeing at the moment in Australia kind of huge reflections on how the care system is working, and there's a Royal Commission being established. And so the answer is partly, it depends on which bit of the dementia agenda that you are looking at. But there are, I would say, always lessons for the UK from around the world. And that's one of the things that we try and continually highlight.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one more question. I'm sorry if I haven't got to all the questions that people would like asked, but one more question, somebody, which I think is really important. So this is somebody called Carolyn who says, I'm somebody living with early dementia. Could I be involved in research? And I think that is often people's hope, that they can participate in research. Are there opportunities for people to get involved in research?
So on the basis, on the assumption that she's living in the UK, yes, there's a program called Joint Dementia Research. You can find it online, where you provide your details and it links you up into clinical trials. There are very similar schemes that operate across Europe and in the US. And, you know, perhaps it's a good point in some ways to, I presume as we're drawing to a close, but to reflect on this, which is at the start of this session, you said about how drugs won't benefit people who are living with dementia today, which is absolutely right. The sad reality is that 100 years on from the development of Alzheimer's, from Alzheimer's first being described as a disease, we can no more through drug interventions stop or slow the disease than today. And because of the way the disease develops, because of the way treatments develop, treatments won't benefit people who have dementia today in all likelihood. But what is astonishing is that knowing that, so many people, like that questioner, are willing to take part in clinical trials. And with all the challenges and difficulties of taking part in a clinical trial when you have dementia, and they want to do so, not to bring benefits to themselves, but to bring benefits to the people who follow them. And so to reflect on your question, do I have hope? Yes, I do, because I see things like that.
Lenny, I think that's a really good note to end on. I'm not sure whether I describe you as a realist or an optimist, but I think you're a bit of both. And that's probably the reality of where we've got to. But I think the encouraging thing is to feel that the agenda is still there. The focus on achieving some results by 2025 is still there. And you're going to make sure through the World Dementia Council that that attention remains focused and remains effective. Thank you for joining today. I'm sure people have learned an awful lot from what they've heard today. And it's, I'm sure, a number of themes that we'll pick up in this series of live conversations going forward. So just to let everyone know, next week, I'm delighted to be joined by Sheila Robinson, who herself is living with dementia. She's a fascinating person, diminutive in stature, but enormously tall in her knowledge and experience, both from her family experience with dementia. She has it herself, her husband has it, her mother also had it. So she knows firsthand, but also from the importance her faith as a Quaker has enabled her to cope and learn from struggle and challenge that often comes with dementia, as well as the opportunities that come as well. So Sheila, I think, will be picking up on some of the themes we picked up on with Terry Waite, and also picking up on some of that involvement in research that we've talked about with Lenny today. So Lenny Shallcross, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining. Please do go to the CareVision site if you want to hear more about the programs they have available. And I look forward to seeing people next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. Thanks for joining.